Hi, I'm Jana DiCamilla, and on this week's episode of Still Searching, I'll introduce you to one of our experts, forensic psychologist Dr. Chris Kunkle. So, welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us on Still Searching. Can you just first introduce yourself and tell us your title, and then we'll get started?
Yes. So I'm Dr. Chris Kunkle. I'm a forensic psychologist. And in relationship to case investigations, I'm the Associate Director of the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College.
Yes, with Dr. Christina Lane, who our
Yes.
viewers are already familiar with,
Yes.
who has spoken a lot about you. So this has been anticipated here, so we can actually put a face with the name
Yeah.
and get to know who you are and what your expertise are. So I know sometimes this could be a little bit of a daunting task, but take us back to the beginning. How did you get to where you are in this kind of criminology world?
Yeah. Okay. So I started my career in investigation as a forensic scientist at the Orlando Crime Laboratory for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So that was my first effort into the business. I had gotten a bachelor's degree in chemistry and forensic science from the State University of New York. I decided to look for positions in Florida because it seemed like there were quite a few. So I decided to start my career down there. Um, Quickly after getting into the crime lab and doing lab work and starting to respond to crime scenes and getting the crime scene training, I realized that there were other interests I had in the forensic realm. And I started researching what other career options I had. I considered moving into investigations, looked at applying to the FBI, looked at applying to be a state law enforcement agent. And then I also looked into um, psychology and forensic psychology and started to read more about that. Um, I decided to go back to school and study psychology to see if I liked it. I mean, when I first took psychology undergrad, I didn't really think about it as a career and it wasn't really on my trajectory. And then I started studying more in the criminal behavior realm and decided that I'd go and get some more education in psychology and see. And so I did that, and then I decided that I wanted to apply to graduate school and move into forensic psychology. So I did that. I applied to John Jay College. I attended John Jay, got my master's in forensic psychology at John Jay College. And while there, it's where I really got hooked into the idea of staying in the role of and moving my career into the realm of forensic psychology permanently. I still had thoughts of maybe being a federal agent, but really once I started doing practicum work in forensic psychology and working in prisons and doing assessments of offenders, it really became pretty apparent to me that's where my strengths lied and that's where my interests lied and that's where I could really make a career for myself.
Well, it's
Um,
interesting that you say
yeah,
where your strengths lie because that was something that Tina had brought up that it takes a special kind of person to be able to get offenders to open up and to kind of get in that lane that you need to get into to kind of draw out why did this happen or how can we help you?
yeah, it does. I mean, it's an interesting field to a lot of people. And it's just not the right fit for some. Just emotionally, it's just not right, and skill set, it's just not right. Um, there's lots of things I'd love to do too, but I don't have the skill set for it. You know,
Yeah.
so um, it's just I think you have to have some level of emotional detachment. I don't think you can come into this field with your heart on your sleeve and think you're going to save everybody in the world. You know, I think I came in knowing wholeheartedly that wasn't going to happen. Probably a little cynical already, having just life
The
experience
experiences you
and
had, yeah.
working crime scene and, being involved in investigations. I knew there was no idealism to any of this. I truly enjoy analyzing criminal behavior, trying to understand offenders, what makes them offend or what brought them to offend, really, not necessarily what makes them offend, but what brought them to offend, where, if there's a mental illness, what can we do about it? If there's an unsolved crime, how can we use behavior to try to help identify suspects or, move closer to solving the crime? There are a lot of different aspects that I wanted to get into and did. Um,
So how is that moving from, chemistry and forensic science are really kind of like a hard science, I would say, and then psychology is more of that get in your brain and, you know,
yeah.
more of a personal science, I guess you could say. So how was that shift for you?
Um, it wasn't really too difficult. I I think I approached psychology more scientifically than maybe some of my peers. Um, I think some people enter the field being a little bit looser with understanding behavior, and they had, you know, I think the biggest hill I had to climb is I had really very little background in psych training when I got to grad school. And when I got in my doctoral program, I realized how little I knew. Um, and I was in the program with people who had done undergrad and then some master's degrees on top of their undergrad in psychology. And there I was, with a master's degree, and I
Okay, I
thought I
got this.
thought I knew some things. Um, but I think I approached the field very analytically, and I think that's why forensics suited me. I really, as I went through my doctoral training and I picked my practicum experiences, I really just gravitated to forensic roles, and I didn't really diversify myself in that regard. I didn't go strict clinical. Really, if my practicum wasn't forensic, I found the forensic patients in that practicum and ended up getting assigned them, or
Yeah, that was your path either way.
it just kind of ended up that way. But
Mhm.
and I think the biggest piece of chemistry that really helped me was as a lab technician and as a trained, lab scientist, my writing skills were very technical. So when I went about writing psychology assessment reports and now
You were
behavioral
probably like,
assessments of
wow, this
criminals,
is great.
it all just makes sense. And I learned a lot
Mhm.
about technical writing, and I had that skill set already. And they don't typically teach that in psychology programs. So it really helped me. Plus, I mean, stats and analyzing data sets, like it was just innate because of what I had done. And the forensic science piece was really the kicker for me when I was an undergrad. I was a chemistry major. I started out engineering, and then environmental science was a big deal at the time. So I started gravitating towards that, and I never really thought about forensics. And I was right at the beginning of DNA becoming more prolific in the field. So it's like mid to late 80s into early 90s. And I started reading these articles, and I was like, that's some pretty interesting
Exciting stuff. Yeah.
stuff. Like, and I'm a scientist, maybe I can get into this realm. So that's really when I gravitated to forensic science, and kind of things took off from there. It took a lot longer than that, but that's
That's like
really like
the
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 jumping
short
point.
version.
Yeah.
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 So, I know you've done and still do a lot of work in prisons. So, can you talk a little bit about how that started and what kind of keeps you coming back to that?
Yeah. So my first experience in a federal prison, actually, I was just talking to somebody today about this, a colleague who worked in one of the same institutions that I did at different times. But so my first experience in a correctional institution was at Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, as a federal institution.
Wow.
Two of my professors were working there while they were teaching at John Jay. And me and a couple of students had approached one of those professors to do a research project that we wanted to do. And he said, no, you don't want to do that. You want to do this one that we're doing. And he brought us in to do research at the federal prison. And then when I got there and we were doing data analysis and talking about the study, they threw me into the clinical rotation, and I started doing clinical work at the prison. At that point, I had done zero clinical work ever in my life.
That's a great
Uh,
start.
yeah, and they just threw us into the mix, gave us training, and it was really interesting to me. I mean, at the same time, I was also doing research on people who had threatened judges and the president, and so these kind of high profile type cases. It was the Southern District of New York, so there were high profile um, prisoners in the prison at the time. So there was a lot to soak in and kind of be enamored by. Um, and I just kind of got hooked that this was a place where I could practice psychology, do testing and assessment, and also some research. And it just seemed like a really good fit for me. And at that point, I was in a master's program, so I was making career decisions at that point with what was I going to do after I was done with my master's degree. Um,
Kind of fell into
so,
place at the perfect time.
right. Yeah. So I started applying to doctoral programs. It took me a year, really 2 years after getting my master's to get into a doctoral program. It's super competitive. You have to find ways to make yourself stand out more. Everybody applying is super smart, great grades. Yeah. And it really
Yeah.
just have to keep applying and praying, right?
Yeah. Just hope
And,
for the
you
best.
know,
Hope for the right spot.
so eventually I get into a doctoral program and I happened to come across a good fit at CW Post. They had people who were forensically trained that I could work with, and they had people who were focused on domestic violence. So it was an interpersonal violence. So it was really interesting to me. And I was just able to make my way. And being in New York City, I just had numerous options for practicum work, and I ended up working at Bellevue Hospital on the forensic ward as one of my practicums. Um, and I ended up working with a program on Long Island where we were trying to develop better connections for the police and mental health to respond to people with mental illness in the community. There were just all these forensic things to really wrap my arms around and get involved in.
At Bellevue, was the forensic unit kind of like people that were confined? I can't think of the word.
Yeah, so Bellevue, the Bellevue Prison Ward is the acute psychiatric hospital for Rikers Island, basically
Okay.
for anybody incarcerated in the city of New York, pending charges in the county jail or serving their county jail sentence, which was up to 365,
Mm,
and then they would transfer to state prison. But most of the cases that would end up on the unit were people who were pending charges.
okay.
So they were pre-adjudication. We got involved in
Like they needed
testing
like a mental
people.
health analysis first.
Yeah, so a lot of times inmates would either be legitimately mentally ill or feigning mental illness and end up on the unit. So I got a really good experience in assessing the difference between real life mental illness and those who were attempting to feign it to change the trajectory of their law or their legal charges. Um, so I got really good experience there, and that place is just fascinating. Just, I mean, mainly because New York City kind of has this mystique about it, but you're riding to work on the train, reading the New York Post, and then you get to work, and the person
There,
who's
yeah,
on the
they're
cover of the
from the
Post is
headlines,
there,
right?
and you're having to deal with their issues and their case. So it's just kind of a really interesting experience, and I think like Law and Order SVU has made Bellevue kind of famous in that regard, always, kind of featuring that
That's what I was
place.
gonna say. Anyone
Right.
who's seen a crime show, they know, oh, well, we've got to
Right.
make sure they're not mentally ill first, that they can stand trial. And so that's really interesting that you were a part of that process. And led me to a question, one of the things you said, where you got a lot of experience, kind of telling the difference between who was actually mentally ill and who was feigning it. Um, Tina mentioned something about the psychopath being very manipulative and kind of just as they go, even through treatment or through incarceration or committing crimes, they kind of just learn how to manipulate people better. So I'm sure you've run into your fair share of psychopaths. But
Yes.
how, can you talk a little bit about that whole process of learning to manipulate better and how that happens?
Yeah, so I mean, psychopathy's pretty fascinating, and incredibly damaging, right? Because they just take advantage of people and they're really programmed either organically and socially to not have any remorse, not have any empathy, um, to just be callous about their approach to life. They're they lie indiscriminately. You know, and they're, I guess psychologically, it's interesting to try to tease out, whether it's psychopathy, whether it's whether they're psychopathic and feigning mental illness, or whether there's really some legitimate mental illness underneath the psychopathy sometimes.
Right.
And, I've learned throughout the years that both can be true, right? Somebody can be um, severely mentally ill and when
Have that
treated
element.
and stable, extremely psychopathic. And when they're unstable and untreated, things can really get um, difficult to manage, especially in the prison sentence when you put a person like that in prison, which is often where they end up, and you increase the levels of confinement, they become more combative, or they become more cunning and manipulative, depending on how they adapt to the situation.
Mm.
And psychopaths don't always use the same tactics. They're responding to the environment.
Right.
So if they're able to get away with manipulation, they may take the easier route, the less violent route. But when faced with a more challenging, um, or just a more challenging situation that they can't seem to use manipulation to get through, they may resort to violence. Um, so it's just professionally, it's been really interesting working with those cases. And seeing the person behind it as well,
Yeah.
because a lot of people don't see that. They just hear psychopath and they're not thinking the person behind it. Everybody thinks it's a serial killer, and they're not all serial killers. Actually, most of them aren't. And
But that exact same thing.
yeah,
Most of them are good businessmen, or they're the buddy that you run into at a party that is really fun to talk to, but will cheat you out of your money, or like
yes,
you said,
yeah.
lie to get what they want at every turn.
You just hope they care a little bit about you so they
Yeah,
don't
right. So
do it
you're
to you.
spared.
Right. Or, I mean, I've learned in working with a lot of psychopaths that if if you're kind of a formidable challenge for them, they're going to seek a lesser challenge. Like they're hunters. So they're going to find the weaker
Right.
person unless you're the only option, right? Then they're going to do what they
Target.
have to
Yeah.
do. But one of the quotes I always use is actually one of Israel Key's quotes. He's hunting for victims. He's waiting. He's waiting for somebody specific or like a specific type of person, and he sees a couple, and he said, it looked like it was going to be too much work. Like that's literally the psychopathic mindset.
Yeah.
Not, I didn't feel like killing someone or it'd be terrible to kill this person. It looked like it would be too much work. I
Yeah.
didn't
I
want to
wanted
get
an
into it.
easier kill.
Yeah, I needed to be lazier, right? Um, but so it like that's like the
But it's like
quintessential
the quickest way to
psychopathic,
get to what they need or what
right?
they want.
What they want, yeah.
Mhm. So talk a little bit about your experiences that kind of led you to Cirque and working with Tina Lane.
Oh, so
Switch gears a little, sorry.
yeah. Um, so I met Tina. Actually, Tina was seeking a professor to teach criminal profiling and serial crimes. So she called the unit I was working with. I was working with the sexually violent predator civil commitment program in New York. I was one of the examiners who was doing assessments to determine if people needed to be confined as sexual predators. So I she called my unit. I think she talked to the secretary and said, I'd like to speak to one of the forensic psychologists over there. I'm looking for a professor to teach serial crime. So she got me.
Here you are.
And I went and met Tina and we talked and I took on the class and we formed a relationship. Um, I've known Tina now for 15 years. Um, I always can remember because the day I started working, my daughter was born. And so I know how old she
Yeah,
is.
that
So I know how
doesn't
long
leave your
I've
mind.
known Tina. I literally showed up for class and said, I had a baby this morning. Here's the syllabus. I'll see you next week.
That's a way to be remembered. Here's your new
Right.
professor. He's a new
Yeah.
dad.
So we were at College of St. Rose then. And I was pretty deeply involved in the sexually violent predator stuff at the time. So I was just teaching and doing that work. And then a couple of years into that, a guy by the name of Kenneth Maines pulled me and a group of forensic specialists, professionals, retired law enforcement, retired FBI people together to form a group called ASOC. So it was American Investigative Society of Cold Cases. And that effort was to solicit agencies um, who wanted assistance with their cases and have the case be reviewed by professionals. And it was a big group of professionals there. At some point, there was probably 50 or more of us who would, not everybody worked on every case. We would field it out
All
to
spread
to
across the
everyone,
country, right?
and then those who could get involved would get involved. And So it was really early on in getting involved with ASOC. I went to an ASOC conference, and I came back from the conference, and I went to Tina and I said, I think we could do something really cool here at St. Rose with the students. Other colleges have different forms of internships, and we could form relationships with some of the law enforcement agencies in the area and maybe offer some assistance. We can offer professional assistance, and we can also train the students and have them work on live cases and really
Real world
the agencies give them real world experience, right? And give the agencies some man hours that they don't
assistance need.
have, right?
Yeah.
So we approached a couple agencies and we talked to the school, and the school didn't really want to do it. So that was like maybe 2014. Um, we kind of broached the subject again a year or so later. Like, climate wasn't really the best. And At one point, I said and I had been doing some work with the missing children's ride, the ride for missing children that's every year in the capital region. And I met Mary Lyle through there. I met Stacy Heron, Audrey Heron's sister-in-law, and I just started meeting people in the missing person, like,
It's sad to see it
advocates.
as kind
Yeah,
of a community. Yeah.
community. Yeah, it really is community. And volunteering with the ride and going to Missing Persons Day, all in connection to what I was doing with, teaching at St. Rose and my work. And I said to Tina, I'm like, I really think Mary Lyle could be a key person to talk to and just maybe make some connections through her, tell her what we want to do, what we're interested in doing, how it could help these cases along. Um, and In the midst of all that, I decided that I was going to move to South Carolina. I got an offer to take a job down here, opening a sexually violent predator program with a private business who was taking over the contract for the state of South Carolina. And it was a good opportunity for me. And I'd moved away from the North before, and I was ready to go again.
Yeah.
Um, and
Cold up
so,
here.
so we left, and I don't think I was here 8 months before, Tina was like, well, do you want to keep teaching? And I said, sure, I'll do, if the college is good with it, I'll teach remotely, I'll do online. And shortly thereafter, the college said they wanted to try and open the cold case center. And Tina's like, what do you want to do? I'm like, well, I want to do it. Like, of course I want to
Yeah.
do it. So,
Sorry I
um,
left, but I still
yeah,
want to do it.
so we'll figure out how to do this,
Yeah.
because originally it was written like I was going to be the director and I would take on that effort. And now I was gone. So I'm like, well, Tina, you're gonna have to do it then. You're
Yeah.
gonna have to be the
Well,
director,
luckily
which, and
she is
she's
no pushover.
and
So
she's wonderful at it.
yeah.
So, um, and
Well, it's
so
interesting to hear how it took so much of a start and now you've carried it from one school to the next.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I knew once it got going, it was gonna be great. I mean, for the students, I just think it's a huge draw. I think that, we're still relatively new to Sage. It's only been 2 years now. Really, we're into our second year. Um, and some of the students we have were at the school already, but I think as we started to see at St. Rose, we were starting to draw people in who maybe wouldn't have normally come to the capital region to go to school.
Yeah, one of the girls that I've spoken with that's a part of the program, she said she came here from California for
Yeah,
this program specifically, and someone else from New York City. Like
yeah,
it's drawing that attention and that appeal because of the real world effort that it's actually, producing and also the, just that experience is invaluable.
yeah, yeah. So, um, yeah, it's just that situation where we have, students who are actually seeking to be involved now. It
Yeah.
just ups the talent that are involved in the cases, and increases the capabilities of the center. Um, and it really is going to help the mission a lot more. I just, it's a no lose situation, really. From my perspective, I
Yeah.
think the worst thing that could happen is, we end up with too much work, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like,
And
there's nothing, it's
right,
things that need to be done either way. And, Tina said before, it's like you're handing law enforcement, here you go. This is all this mess that you had. Here it is compiled and pretty little bow on top. At least now you can sift through in an
yeah,
organized fashion. Speaking of that, before we run out of time, we've got like 5 or so minutes left today, but
okay,
can you talk a little bit about just what the students do as a part of, being
yeah.
part of CIRC?
Yeah, so I think what a lot of lay people don't understand because they see a lot of law enforcement on TV is the pace that the police work at and the volume of information that is coming in at any one time. When you're working in a live investigation, new information is coming from all these angles, and if you're working more than one case, it can be incredibly daunting. So you're bringing all this information in and you're sorting it in the best possible way you think. And 10 years later, when that case is not solved, their hand now they have this box that was organized by someone or maybe by multiple people because they moved from case to case. People also don't realize that police get promotions and they
They move on. Yeah.
they're professionals, they want to move up in their position or they move to a different bureau or they have a different interest, so they watch SVU and God, they've been the same detectives in the same bureau for 2 decades
20
now,
years,
of
right.
course. Um, so as those cases get passed on, it just the file builds and there's really no organization to it. So if you're assigned an unsolved case as a detective that's 20 years old and you're working live cases and your superior says you're going to work this case and they hand you a box, it's daunting to try to even get the
Yeah,
download
to
on
piece
the
through it.
case. So
Right.
that's the first thing we really help with is we take this case that you described, it's just kind of in disarray where it's organized for somebody. It's not really clear who, but and we put it together in a systematic way. And we're also digitizing. So digitizing is one of the keys to
Priceless.
all of this. And like I really won't look at a case until it's digitized because once it's digitized, then I can do a lot of things with word searches
Search
and
keywords, right.
categorizing that I would never have the time for. And a lot of times law enforcement is looking to us to organize the case and then with with Tina and I as professionals involved, like what directions do you see? What suggestions do you have? What avenues can we go? Because they're, some want that, some don't.
Right.
It all depends on which agency it is, and
Recommendations, yeah.
and we formed different relationships with each agency we work with. And
Last count, you
it's
were
been
up to
great that
about
way.
10, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's still 10-ish.
Give
Well,
or
and
take.
some agencies are small, so then they don't
Yeah,
actually, they may not have an active case with us. So, I mean, but I still consider them a partner.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, and in the transition to Russell Sage, we've formalized a lot of those agreements. We didn't really have these formal agreements
Mhm.
before. We really formalized the relationship. I think that's helped us
Yeah,
get more relationships. We've also seemingly had some, the agencies have had some success with the cases that we've helped them with. So that's definitely going to drive up the business. And, the goal is to solve every case, but we know that that's not the truth. But
yeah,
the main goal is really to educate students so that we can help feed the workforce, so that when these students go into the workforce and become investigators, they will have been trained and worked on live cases, and to really help these agencies continue to move the needle on these cases, to be able to grab them off the shelf and work them. Um, and we also do some of I think one of the really cool things that the students do, in addition to the organization, because the man hours that takes is just incredible. And I feel them, it can be really boring, but the work product on the other side is amazing.
right.
Um, and without that, we couldn't do it. But the other cool thing is they can really dig into an aspect of the case. We've worked a few really old homicides, and you'd think there's really good maps out there, but there aren't really good maps out there. And they've been able to reconstruct neighborhoods that no longer exist. So we can see, a couple of victims have disappeared in public, right? They've been walking in public down the street, and we've had to figure out what direction they may have taken, where they may have gone, um, who they may have interacted with. So it's really helped with that. And then when we start plotting suspects out, we can put them in the neighborhood, and have them show the proximity
Yeah.
and help with the behavioral aspects of the crime. So, and you couldn't do that
Having
without,
those aspects and then also getting, the knowledge they get from you and from Tina has got to be amazing to send out into the workforce. Like, wow, look at these well-rounded, you know, police officers or criminal justice majors, or
yeah,
they can go into multiple different fields, but use that
yeah.
experience that they've gained.
And I think a lot of them want to, a lot of them want to go into forensic psychology.
Kudos to you.
And and maybe until they have the conversation with me about what they have to do.
The rest
Um,
of the schooling, right?
but we've seen people go into forensic science to be officers, to be intelligence analysts. I'm sure some will go on to be attorneys, and they'll use the skill set no matter which area of the field they go into. I mean,
Absolutely.
I'd love to see a prosecutor or even a defense attorney have the skill set to be able to analyze a case and, either prosecute or defend, their client.
With that
Uh,
different mind.
right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I see the countdown ticking.
Yep.
Um, thank you so much.
This is Still Searching.